So
Yeah,
maybe we can start with my reply and then we'll we can
sure.
go further up. But I think I've understood this now. Basically, what I've written here is that you can't, so that we've got to consider what the context is for my problem. So I was like, how can it be that you can't evaluate an object if you've obtained it by fraud? It said
Yes.
earlier that it's outside the realm of evaluation. And now my thinking on this is, okay, what's the assumed context here? The assumed context is that for us to survive and thrive, we need to
Yes.
do that by a particular method of thought and action, which means principles. So for example, we need to be, let's say, guided by and function by moral principles. So that's the assumed context. Um,
Yeah.
and if you obtain an object through irrational action, so the example given, I think later in this thread, was fraud. If you obtain an object by fraud, that is outside moral principle, and you can evaluate it in terms of moral principle, like this is bad for me or this is good for me because it is moral or immoral. But you cannot evaluate the object in relation to your other values. And I think that's what Leonard Peikoff was trying
Mm,
to get at, is like, okay, maybe I'm wrong then, but that was my understanding. So you evaluate the method as good as bad, for example, the fraud, or because you can evaluate that against the moral principles, but the object itself is a blank. It's a cognitive blank because you don't know, you have no common standard to go, okay, here's this breakfast in relation to my um in relation to the rest of my day, or in relation to, I'm trying to think of an example, this value, this food in relation to not eating, or this food in relation to, I don't know, a piece of bread that I have at home. You can't make that evaluation once you're outside that framework, the moral principles, which provide some commensurable standard for that evaluation. And I give an example, which is,
yeah.
if I obtain a breakfast by cheating a shopkeeper and he later hits me with a rock, does it make sense for me to say that the breakfast was good because I enjoyed it while it lasted? Like in that moment, well, I had a good breakfast. So does that mean the breakfast itself was good or bad? What about if I suffered no immediately perceivable consequences? So I have the breakfast, I've obtained it by fraud, and I'm enjoying the breakfast. But maybe later I start obtaining more things by fraud. Does it still make sense to me to think, like, to properly think through this situation? Does it make sense for me to look at just the breakfast? So meaning evaluating the object in terms of my other values? Or
I
does it make sense?
think
Yeah.
you're close, but
Oh, okay.
that's not quite it.
Oh,
I mean, I think part of this there, your example, I mean, you're evaluating good by some kind of standard still, I think. This is regard to pleasure, or whatever it might be, or whatever good might mean. I mean, you're still evaluating, I think, in the way you phrase that. I mean, it's not that you've abandoned it in that sense, but you just changed the way you've been thinking about it. It's not that it is an example of abandoning a principle, but I don't think you really identified what was actually abandoning it. I mean, if you're trying to evaluate by some standard, such as pleasure, I think I'm not sure if you could say you abandon all standards or that there is no standard. It's just because it's an incorrect standard, but it's a standard nonetheless. Or you might be thinking there's other principles, or you can just pick a new principle, which is a different issue entirely, I think. Whether or not there's multiple principles or there's alternative principles, depending
okay.
on pleasure, say. So I think it's a separate question. Would but I'll go back to my answer up
Okay,
above.
I'll go up.
See, first I'm trying to identify and speak a statement. What is even irrational? And what kind of things he's evaluating as saying are irrational, like irrational action, irrational thoughts.
Yes.
He's saying whether you're following a standard of a process, like the standard for thinking is rationality, the standard for goals is, or the standard for acting is a goal. So the entire process involves having a proper standard by which to seek those out, to attain those ends of thinking or actually the goals of your actions. Does that
Well,
part make sense?
so there's a couple of things that I didn't quite follow, but we'll just go one at a time. So when you say, okay, irrationality is when you abandon the proper standard of a process. In this case, is the standard moral principle, or is the process
The
moral
standard would
principle?
be like the standard for like action is goals. The standard for thinking is um, cognitive standards or whatever it might be. It's just simply what there's a standard to begin with.
What's the process refer to?
Well, go back to Picasso's quote then. I'll
Okay.
just point that out.
Yes, here.
Where he's saying that in epistemology, rational mental processes detach a conclusion from cognition in that sense that mental processes must go towards the realm of cognition, or and like the standard is cognition in a way, or within ethics you got action attached to goals in the realm of evaluation. So goal standards are the goal, goals are standards,
and then the process is the action.
The process would be what overall like thinking or rational action or action. Because action is not just really an event, it's a process. It's not just the one thing that happens.
So like means to end?
Or the entire thing. Both.
Okay.
The entirety. That's how you judge the quality or standard or the nature of the process. What's rational, what's not.
And
so just to start out. Yeah. When we speak what?
When we speak of a goal, so the goal is the standard. That implicit in that is moral principle, right? Like that. So there's this. Let's say there's the breakfast, which is the goal, and that's the standard. But then, in your statement, implicit in that goal is also we're assuming like moral principle too, right? Is that?
You have to develop the principle. Yes.
Okay.
But you just start with that standard. Once you recognize the standard, then you develop principles to help you think about it better. To take in the concretes. Then you create that principle, or that's when you use principles to handle all the details and the concrete situations or all the exceptions and all that, to be able to handle all the information to deal with, say, action and all that. So you have your principles.
Okay.
So if you abandon the standard, then how do you have your principles anymore? I mean, the principles are based on the standards. So without standards, what are the principles?
Right.
You can't have principles anymore.
Right.
So then we get rid of the principles. What would that mean? So I'm saying, ignore principles. There's no way to determine any way to what's good or bad. I mean, you're abandoning even like a standard of, say, pleasure. Like if there is no standard, it's like there's nothing, it's just merely arbitrary. I can do whatever I want. Well, there's no way to figure out, was it good or is it bad? It's just like just a reaction. There is no determination. There's no like definite answer.
Okay, I got it. So are you looking at this even more broadly than just, say, objectivist moral principles? You're looking at this from any principle. You're abstracting even away from that. I get it. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And,
so when,
the principles are the way to get determinate answers, to find the answer, the correct one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when corresponding principles are abandoned, there is no determinate way to figure out. What is a determinate way to figure out how to evaluate?
There's a process, there's a way to get at the answer. Like a more obvious example, like how do you get the answer of like 3 + 2? There's a very specific method to get 3 + 2 the answer, which is 5. I mean, the rules of addition. Determinate could be like whatever the rules might be, like follow your self-interest or be honest or whatever it might be. It gives you the standards and the means of judging the right answer. Like that there's an answer rather than a best guess or something.
Okay. So basically there's no method and failure is guaranteed without the principles.
Or failure is completely unknown. Or success
you can't
is merely by chance.
Okay.
Yeah, just any success is by accident.
I'm trying to draw an analogy here to the way we deal with, in my mind, I was trying to draw an analogy to the way we deal with the fact that we're non-omniscient is by setting the context, by specifying the context for a certain item of knowledge. And the way we deal with the fact that we're fallible is through logic. And if we adopt logic, we can still make a mistake. But if we don't adopt logic, then you're guaranteed to make a mistake. So that's the analogy I was trying to draw. Like, okay, in this case, if I abandon principles, then I'm guaranteed to go wrong. But if I adopt principles, I can still, what I can say is I can still and make a mistake. I don't know if that's an appropriate analogy, but that's what my mind was thinking of.
An analogy is just that you would have no idea whether you'll succeed. There's no way to guess, or
Right.
It's just like winning the lottery. Maybe usually you'll fail. Sometimes you'll get it right, but it's not because of what you did. It's just incidentally, like if you meet your friend at the mall you never planned to, it's like by accident. Like it's not that you never meet them by accident, but it's nothing you did that led to that. And it's just kind of, go ahead.
Sorry, I'll let you keep speaking. It's just, so you're talking about the mall, right?
Yeah, you can run into somebody by accident without doing anything to lead that to happen. It's kind of like indeterminate. It's like just a chance event. Not literally chance, but it's nothing that you did with your thinking or your interactions that led that to happen.
And is another analogy, if we want to look at this specifically within the context of objectivist moral principles, would it be something like, I obtain a piece of bread by spending the day working and making money without having any idea of if that's good or bad, versus, like instead of stealing it, I do it that way, but not because I know if it's good or bad. I just, on that day, I happen to work and make enough money to buy bread. And so it just turns out that I obtain bread in a way that's beneficial to me. But is that an analogy? Like if I don't think about it, sorry?
It could work.
Okay.
I mean, in a way, the value of principles, even to confirm your self-esteem, is not just that you're doing things incidentally, because incidentally they're beneficial, but they're actually part of your way of being. It means a more complex point, but principles are part of following your nature and help you fulfill your nature even better when you're doing it for purposefully and with specific reasons, and to attain those ends deliberately.
This is within the objectivist context, right?
Yes.
You said something like, okay,
yes.
So that did you say they're part of your self-esteem, or what did you say?
Yeah, that would, or lead to your self-esteem, because
they lead to
you're living through your nature. You're following the principles to attain your life. Like life as a process.
I get it.
Part of that process.
Right. And because you're in harmony with your nature, if I want to speak very abstractly, then you're getting, we could just say you're in harmony with reality. So things are going well and you feel good, something like that, right?
Living according to your nature.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And okay, cool. So there's no determinate way to figure out how to evaluate something. The determinate way to figure out something is to use principles. All right.
And in this case, usually it's logic is one of those ways, of course, to make those determinations, for example. And principles are usually formed logically, so I mean they go together.
Well, sorry, what do you mean? So
I'm saying logic is a way to figure things out in a determinate way. And that's part of why it's rationally used logic, because it helps determine answers to things.
So just to clarify again, so when you're saying determinate, you mean assuming you follow the method, you will be right. That's
yes, as far as human cognition goes.
Yes.
That we know how to figure out answers. I'm not saying we'll get the right one. In this context, I determine it. I mean, an answer can be figured out. You might not get it right, but there is one answer out there, or there's an answer. It's just a matter of figuring it out. But like in the way that there's a nature to everything, you just need to figure it out.
Right. So this is why I think I was trying to draw that analogy to
Yeah.
fallibility and non-omniscience, because if I reach a conclusion through logic and I've specified the context, so I reach the conclusion through logic, which is logic is the tool I use to address my fallibility, and I reach it by also specifying the context, which is what I use to address my non-omniscience as a human. Then I can be wrong. Well, I can be right in method, but some new factor, relevant causal factor, is introduced, which doesn't contradict my old knowledge, but introduces a qualification. And so in that
Yes.
sense, it's determinate, because if I'm following the method and I've adhered to the method and I've reached a conclusion, that conclusion is right in some sense, right? From the
Yes.
perspective of like within that context it is right. So we're saying the same thing here about principles in relation to standard, right?
Yes. That
Okay,
sounds right.
cool. And then last thing is, since there would be no determinate way, there would be no way to figure out how to evaluate something. So, okay, maybe let's break this down. So evaluation is a kind of judgment in relation to a standard.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That's how I'm using it.
And so what I'm confused about is, why is this different from the way I was conceptualizing it? I think you said something, I wrote this down. I didn't quite get what you were saying. You said something like, I haven't identified what was abandoning it or why it was abandoned. I don't quite remember exactly what you said.
It seemed that you weren't identifying exactly abandoning a standard or abandoning the principle of the standard. Because you said that
Okay.
it makes sense to say the breakfast was good because I enjoyed it well. Still some kind of standard. Enjoying it is a kind of standard, even if not necessarily rational. And I would argue with Peacock that that's at least a method, even if wrong. It's a
Okay.
method nonetheless.
I think
That's all I was saying.
All right, I'm not sure I fully followed, but I think what you're saying is that I haven't taken it a step further and looked at it even more abstractly. It's like, because this is about standard to principle rather than specifically about objectivist moral principles. And
Yes.
in my example, I gave the example of a breakfast and not being able to evaluate the breakfast itself as good. Oh, actually, I don't know. I need to think about this. I'm not clear on it, because I thought that what I was trying to do with this example, where is it? Oh, the breakfast. Yeah. I was trying to say that, you know, it doesn't like, I can see actually that it doesn't make sense to evaluate the breakfast itself, the object, because
Yes.
in this example I give, like that someone's obtained it by cheating, like, you know, if you get hit, can you still say that breakfast was good? Like it becomes a mess. Like you can't even think about that properly, because it's you can't think about it in isolation to everything else, and the principles are what let you think about that in relation to everything else, which is why I said it was like a commensurable standard. So then you're saying that because I've not factored in this I've not thought about this on a more abstract level, good, the enjoyment in the moment could be considered as a standard or something like that. Yeah.
Perhaps. I
Okay.
think you're on the right track when you were implying it'd be very messy to even think about. And I'm just kind of saying it, why is it messy? Is kind of what I'm getting at here.
Okay.
And that would be more abstract. Like it's messy
Uh,
because
I
your
see.
standards are missing, or it's messy because there's no way to figure it out anymore.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by it's now indeterminate. How do you figure it out? Well, I don't know, flip a coin.
Okay. I see.
If you
So,
just flip a coin, there's no, I mean, if you just flip a coin, then it's like, it's in a way indeterminate because there's no method to do it. All you can do is rely on pure chance, and you've abandoned a method.
I get it. I think I get it. I get part of what you're saying. So basically what I've done is so I can see that it's messy and I can't evaluate the object on its
Yes.
own without relation to the
Right.
standard, but I've not made the full identification of why this is the case.
Yes.
All right.
I would
I
say
need
that's
to,
what you
okay. I need to
need, the
think
more
about this
general.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just need to abstract it a bit more. It's on
Yes.
the right track though. It
Yeah.
makes sense. It's not wrong. It's like just add a little more to it. And I think you have it.
Rather than add a little more, think more widely, maybe. Yeah.
Yes.
I'll go over this
More
again.
widely.
Okay, cool. I'll have to think about this more and come back to it. It took me actually quite a while, like when I was reading these, it actually took me something like an hour and a half or longer to kind of get my head around some of this, even, which seems to be, yeah. Anyway. All right. Some of these are just random, fun little things I want your opinion on. What do you think of this?
Don't like that one. It just
Why?
bothered me when algorithms are opinions encoded. I mean, opinions there. I mean, that just makes it sound like any way of doing things is just an opinion and subjective. Like algorithms are more specific than that. Opinions encoded, like it just doesn't. I don't like it.
I found it in this book, Uncharted, in relation to social media optimizing news feeds and stuff, and and also book recommendations optimized to you. And so I think in that context, I think of algorithms as, you could have an objective algorithm, like for example, an algorithm for a calculator of some kind.
Yes.
That's not an opinion.
Yeah.
But then maybe a book recommendation might be, in the sense that there are many optional standards you could use. But then I don't know if it's not arbitrary. But anyway, I think that's what it was getting at, like optimizing book recommendations and news feeds and so on.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense. I don't like the phrasing.
Yeah. And then this is something I was thinking about. I think I may have said this to you before, but basically anything dealing with subconsciously automated material and the encoded is in the realm of psychology. Like, for example, if I'm talking about my habits, or if I'm talking about changing automated thought processes, well, maybe let's throw out automated thought processes. But if I'm talking about, because that complicates it, because it does involve philosophy partially. But if I'm talking about, let's say, habits, anything that's subconsciously automated, associations, habits, dreams, that's psychology. If I'm talking about the conscious, then it becomes philosophy. So for example, if I'm going through, if I want to consciously make a decision about something, that'll involve philosophy. But there's a sense in which once I've done that, it becomes almost permanently encoded and a feature of who I am. And then at that point, it becomes psychology, because I can look upon my day and go, all right, where was the philosophy? And it might be difficult to see, but that's because so many of my actions and even thoughts to some extent are previously encoded patterns that were reached through reasoning at one point, possibly many years ago. But now that they're there and I'm operating on them, there's no direct line between a reasoning process and the action or the thought, if you know what I'm saying. If it's automated, you can't see it. So do you think it makes sense for me to create this kind of distinction? Like anything that I've done? No?
I think it's very platonic, the way it's written.
Okay.
In a way that's like divided between mind and body, or the world of forms versus the concrete world, in the sense that like the psychology is just what the brain does automatically and what's encoded, but the conscious, capital C, is above is the world of forms, is the purest sense of thinking that is detached from the body, or something to that effect. That's what the wording feels to me. Well, it doesn't intend that, but it feels quite platonic rather than an integrated nature of the conscious and the automated, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, there's more integrated ways to think even about psychology among psychologists. that you don't need to distinguish these things like, oh, there's a conscious in philosophy and there's a encoded, like whatever that might mean. It's better to think of the nature of reality as a unified whole, and you could divide it up. It's not like there's like a consciousness and then the physical world separate from that. Is
Right.
very platonic to me.
Interesting. Okay. What I was trying to get at was, when I do think about philosophy, and I keep trying to find ways that it's involved in everything, like in the day to day. And then I was reflecting on, like, even my decision making process, for example, whether I buy this razor blade or that razor blade, for example, um, the the decision making process might be automatic and based off previous thoughts. And so I'll just go and grab that one. Like, out of, let's say there's razor blade 1 and 2, I'll go grab razor blade 2. And so I can't, like, when I observe myself, I can't see any philosophical reasoning involved. And so I was like, oh, okay, here's what the problem is. The problem is that there may be philosophical reasoning involved, but it's embedded already. Like, as in, at one point, presumably, when I made some kind of decision, I formed some kind of process. I had some kind of thought around the decision-making process, but I can easily, there are many decisions I might make throughout the day where I can't see any conscious reasoning or thought behind them. And so I've assumed that part of, so I can't see any reasoning behind them. And the reason I was trying to look for reasoning was I was trying to find philosophy in everything. But then the way I dealt with this problem was, oh, okay, what's happening is that a lot of what I'm doing and thinking is automated in some way. And so I can't see any sort of conscious philosophical reasoning process. There's no direct, clear line between this action and a philosophical reasoning process.
Yeah.
But that's because the philosophical reasoning process, let's say, took place 5 years ago. And so the philosophy, when I'm thinking philosophically, I'm only dealing, like, it's only conscious reasoning that philosophy is dealing with. And so I can't see the philosophy in an action that has a previously performed reasoning process in it now. I don't know if that was a bit of a word salad, but do you know what I'm trying to get? Like, if you
Yes, I
sit,
think so.
the way you move, the way you sit on a chair, the way, like, how you choose to eat, I assume there was once some kind of thought process behind that. And you could then say, if you were to rewind 10 years, you could go, oh, okay, here's the philosophy behind this specific action. But without being able to rewind 10 years, or without the psychology, you can't really see the reasoning behind it, if you know what I'm saying. You could reason afresh. You could go, okay, is this rational? Does it make sense? But you can't literally uncover the reasoning behind something you've automated. That's what I meant, was like, it's in anything dealing with that aspect of, like, what is this subconsciously automated action or whatever is psychology. This is probably a very basic, oversimplified distinction, but that's what I was trying to get at.
That could make sense. I think if we try to maybe be a bit more precise about it, like philosophy is generally more abstract. We could say it's about essences, it's about the forms in the sense of the abstract nature of things, or concepts, or universals, whatever term we want to use to describe the abstract nature of things that we use in our thinking. That could be philosophy, in the sense that we're trying to integrate everything about reality into an abstract understanding, or that really reflects philosophy. That we're taking into account everything to understand everything, the why of everything. And maybe the more Aristotelian sense, or I'm not sure if Rand would agree, but the more Aristotelian sense is almost like to treat everything as like everything about the particulars in the world as a science, or as like anything applied about philosophy applied to the world in front of you directly is kind of like applied philosophy. He calls that, usually as in art, like you're applying these ideas, and that's usually the nature of like psychology or even science, is that you're applying what the more general things to the specifics in front of you. And philosophy is about the more general nature of reality, and using that to further understand why things are the way they are. That is mostly what Aristotle is about. Why are things the way they are? Why do things change? That's his most fundamental question. What does it mean to change from an acorn to a tree? Things like that. I mean, you could think about it in terms of philosophy, what kinds of ways can things change? But there's more specific things like how do acorns become oak trees, which is more specific.
Okay. So when you're dealing with the abstract, then you're dealing with conscious thought.
Yes.
And philosophy is concerned with the more fundamental thoughts. So maybe not acorn to trees, but seed to seed to, or cell to, I don't know what, you'd have to go more layers of abstraction, but basically the highest
Yes.
levels of abstraction.
Yes.
But then there's also a sense in which philosophy is applied to, right? Like, because I'm thinking of, if I ask a question about piracy, for example, downloading pirated music, that's application, but that's application of moral thought.
Yeah.
That's philosophical.
Yeah. You could call it more scientific even. I mean, there's ways to distinguish it, like that more general term of science I told you about that is used in German. Like not like science as in I'm doing research with the microscope, but science like I'm studying the nature of the specifics of reality, like history or economics.
Okay. Right. And then,
I mean, Rand would say that ethics is philosophy because it's dealing with the most general things about man's nature and guiding our actions for our individual flourishing. And Aristotle would be a little more general to thinking that like ethics is applied, that ethics is mostly the science of dealing with applying the particulars of people. Like in the way his example is that fish live by a different nature, trees live by a different nature, squirrels live by a different nature, and likewise humans. You can't have a universal ethics across all these creatures. So he's applying it specifically to the people he knows, the world he lives in.
And then what about, so there's a critique of the way I formulated this, but what about the thought itself of like, if I did want to investigate the philosophy behind automated actions and thoughts, I don't know about thoughts. Let's go with automated actions, like things you do, the way you walk, when you choose to go get a coffee or whatever. It's not, I couldn't necessarily, I might be able to back out my philosophy by implication. Like, we talked about if I smash the mouse in anger, I'm kind of embodying the principle of emotionalism, and I'm embodying, what else am I embodying? I'm embodying the primacy of consciousness.
Yeah.
But it's not like I can't, if I'm I'm like superimposing my knowledge now over that, but I couldn't investigate what I was actually thinking when I first started doing that without psychology. If even psychology can do that, I don't know, but I couldn't without psychology. And that's sort of what I was getting at, I think.
Yes, I agree with that part.
And then, okay. What else did I want to ask about that? It makes it hard then to, like, if I wanted to speak to someone and say, hey, philosophy is in everything, that's a very abstruse sort of explanation to philosophy being in everything. At least I don't think I'd get very far with that, saying, well, in the past you went through a reasoning process and that involved philosophy and now it's there and you can't see it. Like, it would be quite difficult to, I don't think that's the way to then identify that philosophy is in everything. That's what I was trying to do originally when I came up with this.
I like to think of it more like philosophy answers why to everything. It's the ultimate why, ultimate answer to why. Every kind of way of asking why. There's so many ways to ask why. that it answers all of those. So
Yeah. And then the difficult part I find is then looking at how the why is involved must be involved and must be answered to some extent in everything you do in every field you engage in. That it's not easy for me to concretize that. You know what I'm saying? Like many people can just go, oh, well, I just want to live. I don't care like about why. You can't answer those questions. That might be sort of the
yeah,
average view of philosophy. And then finding the why, like why there must be a broader or fundamental why involved in every kind of activity involving conceptual thought is it's not easy for me to concretize, but you see hints of it, but I can't eloquently concretize it.
yeah, it's hard. To me, that's the answer that appeals to me. But I think the objectivist kind of answer is usually the most inspiring, like about trying to integrate the value of philosophy with how it allows you to live your life better. I mean, that is practical, that is real life use. That's not just a way of thinking, but it's a way of being that knows what brings us flourishing. But I
Right.
don't know how to make it really succinct,
Yeah.
other than point to Rand herself, because she said it better than me about those things.
Yeah. I've gone through, like philosophy who needs it and stuff, but it's still very
Yeah,
hard to concretize it on your
it
own.
is.
Okay. A question about, can you, I think we've spoken about this before and I'm still pretty unclear. Like, can you take an action? So you can evade knowledge and then you take an action, but are you taking the action on the basis of an evasion? Like if an evasion is not looking at reality, then how can I take an action on the basis of an evasion? Like it would be on the basis of some, I'm getting confused with the wording here, but like, I'll try to think of an example. Like, let's say I, let's say I wouldn't drink wine, and then I go out and I go, I don't care, I just want to drink wine, and I go and drink wine. Like, is the action being taken on the basis of an evasion?
Mm, could be. In another way, it could be that you just abandoned the one, or you got rid of one premise, you just kept the rest. Like you want to just have a good time, so you just ignore one fact. You could evade the fact by you're taking action based on what you do think. That's how I would imagine would happen. Because I don't think you could really truly eliminate every single thought completely unless you're literally, unless drinking, which does make you black out. So yeah, that does make you stop thinking entirely. If you completely evade everything, you will just black out literally, I think. But other than that, I think you're just limiting your knowledge or limiting your focus. You're contracting your focus so you don't notice as much, so you don't make as effective decisions.
Right.
So you end up making a different decision than otherwise.
Right.
That's how I
You,
think of it.
you see what I was trying to reconcile here, that because I remember reading that about all action presupposing thought. And that's, by the way, the previous quote I put in that I wrote down about
Yeah.
Anything concerning the subconscious is psychology related, but it was previously encoded in with conscious reasoning. And I was trying to get at like, okay, is it true that all action presupposes thought?
I think so.
And so you're saying when you take an
Well,
action on the basis of, yeah, okay.
I'll walk back on that. I'll say that deliberate action or any non trying to think how to distinguish this, because there are ways to act that aren't going to require thought necessarily, like certain
Yeah.
automatic reactions.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of with
Yeah.
the subconscious psychology thing.
But I mean, psychology also includes the conscious, like deliberation. So I should say that
Okay. I see why you thought it was platonic then, because I just
Yes.
massively oversimplified both.
Yes. But as far as evasion, I would say that's a form of, it's related to deliberation. You can't evade by accident. It's part of the more deliberate thinking processes. It is one of the conscious thinking processes. And as a conscious thinking process, I don't think you could have any conscious or any deliberate reasoning if you've evaded everything. Like at some level, you are thinking. Does that make sense?
You're going to have to say that again. I understood part of what
Yeah.
I think what you said earlier is that, so evasion is not a complete platonic blank out on every single thing. It's blank out, a partial blank out in the moment. And so when I take an action,
It's like a blank out of, a deliberate blank out of, or a deliberate overlooking of something that you are able to see. You're deliberately not looking at it, pretending it's not there.
Right. And then the action, when I'm taking an action, I'm
If you take a deliberate action, you've necessarily had a thought. But then you have to ask, can you act in a way like, can you go to a party that you didn't want to go? Like, can you go to a party in any other way besides deliberately? You have to distinguish first what sort of things can happen literally without thought. What sort of things could happen? Are there things like that which could we say like a panic attack doesn't necessarily start because you decided to, it just happened. That could happen sometimes, for example. But if say you are evading, like you don't want to admit that you hate your job and you should quit. I mean, that could be evasion, but going to work is still a conscious thing. You could evade that particular fact, but you've only evaded in the sense that you're no longer considering that thought. It's not part of your premises. You ignore it. It's not part of your thinking. So then it changes your resulting actions.
right.
You'll be acting as if it never was true, or acting as if it never mattered.
Right.
Something like that.
Okay. So then you're taking your action is not, it's not that there's a sense in which you're now going to work on the basis of an evasion, let's say, but there's also a sense in which you're not because
Yes.
it's from previous reasoning.
Yes.
So, okay. And then, okay. So then, yeah, it doesn't contradict this idea that all action presupposes thought, because we're saying, okay, you can, we're saying that, part of your action is determined by evasion and part is determined by previous thought. So it doesn't contradict then.
I would say that sounds right.
Okay. And then this idea of all action presupposing thought, how do I convincingly validate that? Because okay, there are some things that are obvious. Like if I can feel my heart is beating. I don't see why there's previous thought involved there. I can't think of it. Right.
Yes,
exactly. But then let's say my eye is itchy and I scratch the side of my, I just kind of touch my eyelid and it's automatic. Let's say I don't remember, couldn't witness any internal reasoning process that was like, oh, eye is itchy, scratch eye, put finger to eye, rub little, there's no evidence in that case of thought. And I could go for something less, I could go for something else actually. What about I'm in conversation with a friend, they say something, I automatically reply, and I'm like, just moments later, I'm like, oh, where did that come from? I didn't go through a reasoning process when I had this conversation with my friend, even with you, right? Like you'll say something and then suddenly like I'll just talk and reply, and like I might not be able to observe that the action, the words that I'm speaking are based. It's not, basically what I'm saying is it's not self-evident to me when I try introspect that all actions presuppose thought. there are distinctions to be made between biological actions, which I only have the knowledge of, I have the knowledge from philosophy or from sciences and all that. There are some things that are just biological, but then there are definitely, if I just looked at myself without all that knowledge, I would observe that some things I seem to do without thought, and some things I can reason through before making a decision slowly. But a lot of my actions, I could observe that, okay, well, they just seem to be automatic.
Yeah, I think it's fair to divide these things up. I mean, yes, it's true that not all action presupposes thought. We could say all deliberate action presupposes thought. And that's just like one distinction,
But
just to start out.
If we call it deliberate action, isn't that circular? Because deliberate is basically thoughtful or conscious.
In a way, I mean, I'm just saying there are things, like there are these type of actions that are thought, like the thought is directly connected to the action, that the fact that action presupposes thought. And that is the description of this type of action. Saying deliberate thought is the is thought. I mean, there's no kind of deliberate action that didn't have thought, even as obvious as that is. And I think that's all I'm trying to say.
Well, sorry, continue.
Like, as opposed to just, I mean, it just seems simple enough that we know that there's actions we deliberate about, and there's actions we don't deliberate about. And we could just divide up at first simply that way. And then we could think further about it, that while thinking about these things that we do deliberately, whatever they are, what makes it deliberate, what makes another not deliberate. We could say, what's the thing that makes the difference here? You could say thinking is what makes something deliberate. You don't just say that like you wish it to be true, but that maybe you thought out the reasons or had a thought and willed it to be so, or something like that. It's hard to say exactly what, but we could say there are distinctions just by observing. Just generally, there's deliberate versus not deliberate. We could just split things up that way, just to start and see what problems we arise, or see what problems we run into.
What's the definition of deliberate thought other than thought? What's the definition of deliberate action other than action caused by thought?
Slow and steady, extended, spread out, step by step. It's not really a definition here. I'm just going over what's
the characteristics
aspects of it. Yeah. As opposed to, say, these things like an itch, like they're reactions, they're unnoticed, they're automatic, they're habitual, they're instantaneous.
Okay.
You could start distinguishing in those ways.
But the essence of the deliberate thought is the deliberate action. Sorry. The essence is it involves thought, because it's thought that allows it to be sustained, slow, over time. The essence is thought, right? Of okay.
Or you could say continuous thought. Continuous thought might work, because it's not just a moment. It's over a period of time. You can think of a span of time thinking of something. You can think about how long, I don't know, you were thinking about, say, this sentence today. You say, oh, I was thinking about it 5 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever. If there is a span of time, you can at least recall thinking about it.
Okay, so we've got deliberate actions, and then we've got kind of instantaneous actions. But here's my trouble, right? Because the claim is that many instantaneous actions, or all actions, including instantaneous actions, presuppose thought. Maybe not right now, like you're not thinking about performing the action, but it presupposes that in the past you went through some kind of thought process so that it is now automated. And so my issue is that I can't necessarily introspect and see that.
Right. That's true. And this is our part about thinking about mental processes anyway. I think um, it gets really hard.
Okay.
I try to focus on the terms that are like, at least what objective is my focus on? What is focus? What is required of focus, sustained thought? We could have focused, unsustained thought, and we could have non-focused thought, like a reflex, like when you hit your knee, or like a reflex to hit your eye, or something like that. It's not, you're not really focused, nor is it a period of thought. But if you have something like an intuition, it might be like a thought that's instantaneous with some focus because you realize you're thinking, but it's not like I'm thinking it all out. And that might be a lot more automatic and less about deliberate thinking. And then we could have more slower processes like, what do I want to do as my career? Well, that's an extended period of thinking, which any resulting action in the long term has to be a consequence of that thinking. Otherwise, it's just short term action. Or just kind of thinking along those lines is what I would do.
I got a good example for you. Someone gets out of bed and dresses up and then goes downstairs, catches a bus, and is now at work. They don't observe a thought process when they're doing that. Like, it's all quick, right? They put on their clothes to do everything. But you can look at this in layers. So for them to get to work, like there was the first day when they went to work, and they would have had to think like, well, how do I get there? Which buses do I catch? What, and then when they moved into their little apartment or whatever, they're like, okay, what's the best way to get downstairs? Like, well, where are the rooms? Where's the like all that stuff was previously thought out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so when you witness them in the morning, and they witness themselves getting up in the morning and doing everything instantaneously without thought, then all those actions still in some way presuppose thought. And you could, and I said this is in terms of layers, because you could then go even further and say, well, was there a thought process when they first learned to put on clothes? Was there a thought process when they learned to brush their teeth? Was there a you know what I'm saying? And
yeah.
But in the moment now, they don't witness those thought processes that led to those actions.
No.
And okay, that's a good example, because we do know, it's easier to know, okay, yeah, I do remember, let's say, learning to brush my teeth, or I do remember that I had to consciously figure out how to get to work. And now that's automatic and there's no thought, but there was once thought, and I can see that. But some actions, I can't remember, let's say, the thought process that went into them, and now they're automatic. Like even scratching my eye.
There?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hey.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Oh, it says my internet connection is unstable.
It's fine now.
Okay. Yeah, but so you can see, like, you'd need, okay, in that case, this applies, right? Action presupposes thought. But then in those little reflex examples you gave, like, or the one I gave, like, I don't know, just scratching your nose, for example, whatever, like something just that seems simple and small. Like, does that presuppose thought? I don't know the answer to that question, because I can't introspect and say, oh, when I was 0.8 months old, I remember thinking, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, I'd be fine just saying that that's straight up automatic, that it's that most actions presuppose thought, but that's a different class of action entirely.
Okay.
Which I think Rand might be more skeptical than me about saying something is automatic. I mean, I'm not going to say much is automatic, or at least kind of purely habitual, that has next to no thought. But just, I mean, I think some things are automatic, and I think Rand would say virtually nothing is automatic except perception.
So this is where I'm interested, because so in the example of the person dressing up for work, I mean, these are two extremes, I guess. So on the one hand, you can see that even though there's no thought put into the person who gets up to work and brushes his teeth, puts on clothes, gets on the bus, all that stuff, like you can see that there was, even though there's no thought now, there was once, there had to be thought at one point,
Yes.
because those things are not automatic.
Yes.
In the case of like scratching a nose, it's much less clear. But what about, this is one where it's much harder. For example, in conversation, I'm now telling you, Louis, I'm going to make the claim that the way you speak to me, the things that come to your mind, they right now, all the things that come to your mind, your thought processes, everything you're doing right now that you can't sense, you once had to reason, and your philosophy is what influenced that. That is a much harder claim for me to make
Yes,
than,
it
oh,
is.
okay. But that's what I'm interested in figuring out, because
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I don't have a good answer for that right now. That's a
okay.
big question. But I
Okay,
see
well,
what you
let's,
mean.
all right, I might write about that. So let's go the two extremes before you, I'll just let me just, I can do this.